Welcome to Secure Freedom Radio. This is Frank Gaffney, your host and guide for an intelligence briefing on what I think of as the war for the free world. I'm very pleased to say we have a special 1 hour program today with one of the country's preeminent experts on matters involving our national security. He's not just a distinguished and very accomplished analyst and author, the vice president of the Lexington Institute. Our guest, Dan Gouré, has also served in senior positions in the United States government, including as a former member of the Defense Department's Office of Strategic Competitiveness, which he directed for 2 years. He's also been on the Homeland Security Department's advisory board and served in 2001 as a member of the Department of Defense transition team. He is, in short, a man who has extraordinary knowledge and a very thoughtful approach to the various challenges that we're facing, and I couldn't be more pleased to be able to spend a full hour with him talking about them and with you. Dan Gouré, welcome back to Secure Freedom Radio. Great to have you with us.
Always great to be with you, Frank.
I'd like to set this up, our conversation about a variety of different challenges that we're facing and what we should be doing about them, and what, to varying degrees, we are not doing about them, by asking you to sort of, well, set the stage for me, if you will, at the 30,000 foot level on what I call the war for the free world. How do you see the character of the strategic environment in which we find ourselves today, Dan, and the nature of the challenges and the enemies that are bringing them to us?
It's a great question, Frank. I think from that overview level, there has not been a time in my memory to include the Cold War, where the freedom and security of the world, of like-minded free nations, of Europe, East Asia, the Western Hemisphere, has not been at greater threat. And we're talking about a combination of dangers and threats, unlike anything that we saw even during the Cold War, which was primarily a military threat, primarily nuclear weapons, Soviet forces, and the like. We're now facing, I think, three different challenges at that macro level. One is the rise of new regional near-peer powers who want to dominate the areas around them, their continents, if you will. That's Russia, acting even this week to take more of Ukrainian territory. That is China, trying to essentially control the waterways and airways of the East China Sea and South China Sea. It is also the rise of Islamism, the Islamic State being the example, ideology and power directed towards changing the politics, the state structures of a large part of the global environment. So it's not just a military threat, it's an ideological threat, and it's a multi-regional threat. There are very few parts of the world that are not being affected right now.
Indeed. And I guess the point that we seem to be losing, I think, to our extreme peril, is sight of the fact that it's really global war at the moment, and it's hot in some places, of course. In other places, it's less kinetic than, as you say, a struggle for influence and dominance. But talk further, if you would, about how, at the moment, Dan Gouré, we find ourselves dealing with these various adversaries. I've characterized the Obama doctrine, as I think we've discussed in the past, in 9 words: emboldening our enemies, undermining our friends, and diminishing our country. Would you agree that that's kind of a leitmotif here? And if so, what is it doing to our various adversaries and friends, for that matter?
And I might even add a fourth, which is responding weakly and late to self-evident threats, whether it is now the rise of the Islamic State, which the administration admits it knew about months and months ago and was tracking very carefully, but refused to act on. So we have this problem that even if we exactly agreed with the administration on the threats, they got it right. The way they operate is likely not only to not meet the threat, but, to your larger question, embolden other adversaries.
Mm.
It is quite evident from their own statements that the leaders of these various groups, the leaders of nations like Russia, have taken the measure of this administration. It's weakening the U.S. military. It's separating itself from traditional allies. Its effort to cut deals of all kinds with some of the worst people in the world. It's on again, off again support for Assad, for Morsi, and the Islamic Brotherhood. I mean, back and forth. Is such that they now no longer feel they need to take the United States into account when they start operating. And you can see what's going on with Russia in Eastern Europe, despite sanctions, despite the declarations of NATO. Russian tanks are moving in Eastern Europe as we speak.
Yeah. And I guess that's a key point just to drill down on, Dan, is to the extent that we are emboldening Russia and perhaps others as well to act aggressively, this really is creating new dangers for our friends, for sure, and I would include Ukraine, the people who seek freedom there among them, as it is for our own interests and possibly our security down the road. Uh, you're a serious student of these sort of larger historical trends, Dr. Dan Gouré. Visit a little bit about past experience with these kinds of totalitarians and what we could reasonably expect we'll see in the future from say, Russia. Stick with that for the moment.
Well, it's remarkable how similar this period is to the 1930s, where the West was beset by economic difficulties, causing it to reduce its military spending and its willingness to use military force precisely as these totalitarian regimes were rising, rebuilding their militaries, and now in a series of moves using military force to change the borders around them. So what is the essential difference between what Russia did in Crimea and now in eastern Ukraine and what Hitler did in Austria, Czechoslovakia, the Sudetenland? There isn't any. But at each stage of those moves, the thing that was determinative was the weakness of the Western response, the refusal of the West to, if you pardon my expression, draw a red line and then stick by it until when, of course, the worst possible time, when it was Poland's turn.
Right. And at that point, Dan, and again, this is just history, if not perfectly repeating itself, at least certainly demonstrating very similar kinds of cycles, that things are worse when you decide belatedly, as you say, to try to contend with them. Whereas if you had dealt with them early on, you may well have been able to spare yourself and an awful lot of other people great grief. Talk, if you would, for a moment, Dan, about what the implications are for allies as well, and alliance relationships when they see the United States conducting itself in this fashion. Are they likely to either go it alone in ways that may be problematic for us as well, or possibly accommodate themselves to such enemies, ours and theirs, in ways that, again, may be very detrimental to us?
Absolutely. At the present point, you have virtually every U.S. ally trying to figure out which way this country will jump. Will we actually have their back when the going gets tough, or will we write another secret letter to a dictator here or there? Where is that in history? Essentially turning them over to the tender mercies of an Iranian regime or the leaders in China. It's hard to know where countries will go, but we're clearly seeing the lack of willingness of many of our European allies to be staunchly behind us on sanctions. The French are still trying to figure out a way of selling amphibious warfare ships to Russia. I mean, how can you even believe such a thing? Turkey, a member of NATO, a member of this new alliance the administration is trumpeting, refuses to this day to let us use the Incirlik air base, which is just over the border from where the fighting is going on in Syria. They're a member of the alliance. We have a 50-year history of alliance relations with this country, and we're getting nothing from them. That
Yeah,
is either
in part, no question about it, because they have sensed our weakness, our irresolution, and the likelihood that they can do whatever they think is in their best interest with impunity. Dan Gouré, we're going to talk more about whether this circumstance, this environment, strategic environment that you've just described so well, is one in which we can safely, to say nothing of prudently, reduce our military might and capabilities. That and more with Dr. Daniel Gouré, the Vice President of the Lexington Institute. Straight ahead.
As president, I will end misguided defense policies and stand with Caucus for Priorities in fighting special interests in Washington. First, I'll stop spending $9 billion a month in Iraq. I'm the only major candidate who opposed this war from the beginning, and as president, I will end it. Second, I will cut tens of billions of dollars in wasteful spending. I will cut investments in unproven missile defense systems. I will not weaponize space. I will slow our development of future combat systems, and I will institute an independent Defense Priorities Board to ensure that the quadrennial defense review is not used to justify unnecessary spending. Third, I will set a goal of a world without nuclear weapons. To seek that goal, I will not develop new nuclear weapons. I will seek a global ban on the production of fissile material, and I will negotiate with Russia to take our ICBMs off hair-trigger alert and to achieve deep cuts in our nuclear arsenals. You know where I stand. I've fought for open, ethical, and accountable government my entire public life. I don't switch positions or make promises that can't be kept. I don't posture on defense policy, and I don't take money from federal lobbyists for powerful defense contractors. As president, my sole priority for defense spending will be protecting the American people. Thanks so much.
Welcome back. This is Frank Gaffney with Secure Freedom Radio. Very pleased to be joined by a superb guest as well as deeply knowledgeable authority on matters involving our national security. He is Dr. Daniel Gouré, Vice President of the Lexington Institute in Washington, D.C., and a former senior national security practitioner at the Defense Department and advisor at Homeland Security and elsewhere. Dan Gouré, you've just set a very rich table for the rest of our conversation this hour by characterizing a world, well, a world of hurt, I think, is one way of thinking of it. And I just want to ask, as you look at this strategic environment with totalitarian forces of various stripes joining forces, certainly sensing the opportunity to act aggressively against us and our interests and our allies, is this any time for us to be, as you indicated earlier, hollowing out our military? And to what extent is that, in fact, what we're doing at the moment?
Well, you've got it right on both counts, Frank. This is precisely the wrong time to be reducing military forces, and even worse, making them less capable through underfunding so that while they may be on the base, they may be on the end of the runway, they can't really do the job. We are finding just in the last couple of weeks, 1,000 troops going out to fight Ebola, 1,500 more going to Iraq, moving all of our critical airborne intelligence resources from one theater to another, juggling these capabilities because there's not enough to cover the waterfront. You don't have to say the United States is the world's policeman, the sheriff in town, whatever, to say we know there are places that we value. We know there are regions of the world we can't let evil countries, evil regimes, evil ideologies dominate. And therefore, we need the military to, at the best, deter such an event, and worse, ensure the liberation of those areas. This is a military...
Fight the fight. Well, you're going to have to pause for just a second. We'll be right back with more with Dr. Daniel Gouré right after this. We're talking with Dr. Daniel Gouré of the Lexington Institute about the hollowing out of the United States military. And Dan, you've alluded to several places in which it's clear we are currently putting our forces into action, perhaps into harm's way as well, whether it's for humanitarian purposes in West Africa or whether it is advisory roles, we're told, in Iraq and Syria. But what we're certainly seeing at the moment is a serious diminution of the ability of the military broadly to perform its missions. Let's go through various pieces of this in detail because you're one of the country's real authorities on this subject. Readiness of our forces. How would you characterize the level of training that they've been given, the maintenance of their equipment, that is essential to, as you know so well, being able to project power either for deterrence purposes or, God forbid, for warfighting?
Well, people need to understand that readiness is made up of a number of things. You mentioned some of them. You have to be trained. The equipment has to be in great shape. You have to have all the supplies that you need to go into conflict. And what you're seeing with the military now, and it's a period of years of this happening, is the equipment is older, which means it's more difficult to maintain. It breaks more easily. We just had half our F-16 fleet, we love the F-16s, go down because of a structural problem. When that happens, they ground the fleet. They don't ground a single airplane. We don't have the training. We don't have the resources, the dollars to do the kind of aircraft training, the kind of in-combat training. We're inventing new tactics, having unmanned aerial vehicles work with Apache aircraft so we can reduce the total number of helicopters we have. That requires specialized training over a period of years. We have aircraft, like our tanker aircraft, that are now on average 50 years old. A lot of them can only be flown under very benign conditions. We are using other equipment, the U-2, for example. We are using our entire fleet to the max, and we don't have enough of them, and the Air Force now wants to retire them. So you're looking at a case in which it's a military that doesn't have the resources, doesn't have the repairs, doesn't have the training, and doesn't have the access to special equipment that will enable it to fight the way we have seen it fight and win over the last 20 years.
Yeah, and the way we want it to fight, which is not on an equal basis, but decisively superior and able to thereby accomplish whatever mission is set for them with minimum casualties on our end. Dan, let's talk a little bit about something that you've touched on in that answer and that I think is so critical. I can't believe that most Americans would support what we're doing to the United States Armed Forces if they knew this was happening. But talk a bit about the modernization of our military. We've got F-16s, which have been around for what, 20, 25, 30 years, yep. Now experiencing structural failures that are grounding the fleet. You've written very persuasively, I think, about the F-35, a fifth generation aircraft that is now, beginning to become an alternative to the F-35, to the F-16, and a serious augmentation of our Air Force's capabilities. But there are people who are talking about cutting it back, or not buying as many as we are currently envisioning, and more broadly pushing off in this area and in so many others the kind of upgrading of our military's inventory. Talk about the wisdom of doing that, especially at a moment when we're seeing advances in the kinds of adversaries, near peer competitors, I think you called them, and their capabilities.
Our adversaries, big and small, nation state not, are investing in advanced military capabilities. The Chinese are going to have 2 stealth jets coming down the ways very shortly, nuclear attack submarines, ballistic missiles with advanced guidance systems that can home in on ships. The Russians are building new nuclear weapons of a variety of sorts. Even Hamas is investing now, the terrorist group is investing now in unmanned aerial vehicles, which are incredibly dangerous because now with simple technology, you now have a precision-guided air weapon in the hands of a terrorist group. All this is happening even as our modernization efforts are declining. We have got one tactical fighter program in process now, which is the F-35, as you mentioned. We have one bomber program coming down the way to replace a bomber, the B-52, that is over 50 years old. We have no large aircraft, transport aircraft. We've closed out the C-17 program. We have no new cruiser program to replace all those missile cruisers. We're going to try and shove the new destroyers into that. One submarine program, one aircraft carrier program. The list goes on, and we're not modernizing the nuclear force nearly like we should. We're still dependent upon a Russian engine for half of our space launch access. And they could cut it off in the moment. So they're all building out the kazoo. They're all buying modern technology. We are falling farther and farther behind.
Which goes back to the point you made earlier, Dr. Daniel Gouré, and that is that when we conduct ourselves in this fashion, when our adversaries very clear-eyed about shifts in the balance of power, observe what we're doing to reduce our capabilities and to diminish not only those of today, but those in the future, it can only embolden them to more and more acts of aggression, which is, needless to say, something that is not in the interests of our national security or that of our friends and allies. Dan, we're going to pause for a moment, and when we come back, I want to talk with you about a point that you kind of implicitly alluded to there, but that is so central to both where we find ourselves today as a military force and where we will be in the future if we're not careful. And that is with respect to the condition of the defense industrial base, which is relied upon to assure that we have those submarines and bombers and other pieces of military equipment sufficient to hopefully deter aggression against us and our interests in the future. Dr. Daniel Gouré will be back with more of him in this very special assessment of the nature of the threats we're facing in this war for the free world. Straight ahead. Welcome back. This is Frank Gaffney. We're talking with Dr. Daniel Gouré here at Secure Freedom Radio and visiting with him about the kinds of issues that are not only affecting our security at the moment, but what is likely to shape that of our children and our children's children in the future. And Dan, we touched a little bit on this when you described the kind of contraction of the various programs that the United States military has today for replacing very aged equipment, bombers that are older than the grandchildren now, in some cases, of the people who first flew them. Talk, if you would, about the defense industrial capacity of this country and whether enough is being done to attend to it and assure its future viability if, as I think is almost certainly the case, we're going to realize that we've made a terrific mistake and have to correct for it by rebuilding the military that has been allowed to experience this kind of attrition and atrophy.
Well, we have allowed the industrial base, the real arsenal of democracy we used to call it, to essentially virtually disappear. We are down to now a single maker of tactical fighter planes, a single potential maker of bombers, a single maker of large volume, large body aircraft, one maker in effect, two companies, but one line to make nuclear submarines, one company for large amphibious warfare ships, for aircraft carriers, two companies out of dozens to make armored fighting vehicles. The list goes on and on. It's not an arsenal. We're down to essentially single places, single companies, single lines, and in a few cases, there's no line even left. Now, this means even in the near term, even before the war starts, if you wanted to speed up production, if you wanted to add new capabilities, it would be a difficult, laborious task at best. The other thing is we have no capacity really for the kind of innovation, for the kind of starting new activities that we had, for example, during the Second World War when Kaiser said, hey, we're going to build these ships out of concrete. We're just going to throw them together. We're going to get them out there by the hundreds, the same way that the car manufacturers of old built all the aircraft lines, so that when you're looking at a rising power, certainly like a China with industrial capacity all over the place, the ability to compete with that if a crisis comes, not even a war, if we're just doing the build-up thing, may be really problematic. The second thing I want to mention is we also have a war on the private sector. Uh, some conservatives like to talk about it in terms of the commercial industry, the private sector, all this. It's happening in the defense field too. Defense companies are under a cloud. They have the boot of acquisition regulations on their neck, which not only makes it expensive and difficult to do their job, but it is a deterrent to non-defense companies who may have the next bright idea from even going into the business.
Yeah. Dan, two questions occur. One is, to what extent is what you've just described very well and chillingly, is the problem of not having enough of a robustness to our defense industrial base, that we are relying unbelievably, at least in part, and I think increasingly, on, among others, potential adversaries for key capabilities. You touched on this in connection with the Russian rocket recently, but Chinese supplies of silicon chips, for example, and flat screens and the like are now, well, they're the low bidders. And so we seem to be putting them into even sensitive pieces of military equipment in a dependency that is doomed to be deeply problematic down the road, I think. Talk a little bit about that problem.
Sure. Once you go, a couple of levels down in the supplier chain, from the aircraft manufacturer to the component, subcomponent, rest, nobody keeps track. So nobody keeps track of particular small parts of boards, and if they're not the sensitive black things, particularly, you're not keeping track of fasteners and bolts and all the rest. You're getting two problems. One is the potential of having an adversary put malware into the board and all that, but also simply counterfeit and less capable parts, a bolt that will break and take the whole airplane down with it. We are producing very little of the basic material, the basic iron, steel, tungsten, you name it, material that goes into complex items. And we're heading in the wrong direction because everybody wants to invest in production capability out there in Asia, particularly in China, opening up their own factories and all the rest, doing a quid pro quo. And while that may be good for business, private sector business, it's very dangerous when it comes to defense products.
Yeah, and this is the sort of blindness that I think we've been allowing to assert itself increasingly in so many respects. We've got a kind of notion that globalization is the answer to all of our problems. Well, not only don't our adversaries see it that way, but it's clear that to the extent that globalization takes you to a place where you are dependent upon those adversaries for key capabilities, and as you say, it may well be that you don't discover the folly of that until it's too late, but it's something that we ought to be very, very troubled by, I think, and not enough of us even know what's going on. Dan, again, our guest is Dr. Daniel Gouré, Vice President with the Lexington Institute. You formerly, as I mentioned earlier, were Director of the Office of Strategic Competitiveness in the Pentagon. And I'd like to get your thoughts on one issue that has proven to be controversial among conservatives of late, and that is the question of whether or not we should continue to utilize in this country, and indeed maintain, a facility for export financing by the United States government. This is decried by some of our friends, as a matter of fact, as crony capitalism and the sort of thing that should be over the side in the interest of reducing the budget and so on. Talk about the role that the Ex-Im Bank plays, as you see it, in helping us maintain, at least in some respects, some of that critical defense industrial base, and should we allow it to go over the side?
Well, it's a great question, Frank, because in fact, the Ex-Im Bank not only makes money, it's not a money loser, so you can sort of take it on its own terms, but it is critical to a number of companies that still constitute the cutting edge and our advantage. Boeing, for example, which doesn't just make commercial aircraft in competition with Airbus and others, but military aircraft, an increasing a number of military aircraft. So to the extent that they're selling the commercial variant, the cost to the U.S. military of its variant goes down. But I'll give you another great strategic example. We are trying to free Ukraine from its dependence, from the chokehold, really, of Russia through natural gas on Ukraine and on others in Eastern Europe. One way of doing that is by financing alternative energy sources. For example, clean coal. Ukraine is up to its ears in coal. And if you use clean coal, you can replace the Russian gas, and you also clean up the atmosphere because you don't have the leaky Russian gas pipelines, and methane, everybody should know, is like 20 times more destructive to the atmosphere than coal effluvia of any kind. But the point is, we're looking for U.S. companies and others are looking for Ex-Im Bank credits because it's a dangerous area to simply backstop the production. If we could get Ex-Im Bank credits for this kind of deal, then in fact you could strike a blow for freedom as well as the economy of Ukraine and that of the United States. It's a perfect example of a win-win.
It is all of that, it seems to me. And I'm just astonished that people who, well, like you and me, Dan Gouré, do not favor unilateral disarmament, nonetheless seem so determined to engage in it in this case, because in addition to all of the other splendid arguments you've just made for helping to support our defense industrial base, and Boeing just happens to be one example, I think that at a moment when we're buying, as you say, fewer aircraft, the importance of having active hot production lines employing critical workforce that will be usable in the military production capacity in the future is a pretty powerful argument all by itself.
Yes.
But there isn't another major country on the planet that doesn't have a similar kind of export financing facility. And the United States, were it to give its up, would simply, I think, be engaged in an active unilateral disarmament, ill-advised in the extreme and very problematic in all of these respects. Dan Gouré, we have to pause for one more moment. We're going to come back with Dan Gouré, Vice President of the Lexington Institute, and talk a little bit more about other examples, astonishing, scandalous examples of unilateral disarmament at the moment. Straight ahead. Welcome back. We're talking with one of our country's real experts on matters involving our national security. He has practiced it at the highest levels of the Defense Department. He has also been very active in thinking about it and expressing expert opinion about it in front of the United States Congress, in the press, and elsewhere. He's Dr. Daniel Gouré. Today, he is the Vice President of the Lexington Institute in Washington, D.C. And he has been sharing with us his thoughts about a whole host of issues that bring us up to what I really want to drill down on. We talked a little bit about it in the last segment, Dan, in the context of something called the Export-Import Bank. Most people probably don't really think of that as a military capability, but let's talk about some that are unmistakably of a military character, and yet we seem to be busily, well, dismantling these capabilities unilaterally. And we talked about some of the difficulties with our conventional forces in previous discussions, but talk a little bit more about the nuclear forces of the United States, their current condition, the likely replacement of some of these capabilities. You mentioned a bomber before, but nuclear weapons, for example. And again, this is against the backdrop of what our adversary is about, that is very different in character, isn't it?
Absolutely. Look, we are the only nuclear power, major nuclear power, not building new nuclear capabilities, that is, platforms and weapons. The Russians have a major program for land-based ICBMs, for sea-based missiles, for nuclear ballistic missile submarines. They have developed new, better, more mobile theater nuclear missiles, and allegedly have a nuclear attack cruise missile which violates the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, and the administration has been sitting on that. Same thing for the Chinese. Theater nuclear weapons, air-delivered weapons, strategic delivered weapons. There have been recent reports that the North Koreans now have a road mobile, potentially intercontinental nuclear-tipped ballistic missiles, and We know we are worried to death about what the Iranians are doing. It goes on and on and on and on and on. What we are doing is band-aiding and patching an old and aging fleet of weapons, aircraft, submarines. We are engaged in a massive fight, political fight in this administration about whether we should refurbish the one theater or tactical nuclear weapon we have, and that's the one we use to protect our allies in the theater and to create an escalation ladder as a deterrent. Nobody wants, people keep wanting to get rid of it as if doing that will somehow make us safer. We have a new nuclear submarine coming. We're going to have to replace the boomers, as they were called, the subs that carried the nuclear missiles for decades and decades. The trouble is, with sequestration and the money coming down, the cost to the Navy of buying a new set of submarines, even a smaller number of smaller boats, will break the shipbuilding budget, which means we will have to choose between aircraft carriers, for example, and nuclear submarines. We will not be able to have both.
Yeah, nuclear ballistic missile submarines specifically. Dan, this is really a stunning dichotomy, it seems to me. You could have added to the list of things that are really evidence of just how dramatically different is the approach of adversaries to the one that you just rendered. A discovery by a class of students at Georgetown University, to the great chagrin of our intelligence community, that the Chinese have apparently built 3,000 miles of tunnels, hardened underground tunnels. It's been called the underground Great Wall of China, an extraordinary investment, evidently for the purposes, as you know, Dan Gouré, of concealing and perhaps otherwise enhancing the first strike capabilities of China. And I want to just ask you specifically on the nuclear front end of our forces, if you will. Dan, are you troubled by what has been happening since 1992, as am I, which is that we have not tested in a realistic underground test any of our nuclear forces? And to make matters worse, we have been, as you say, sort of using Band-Aids, patching them up by changing out component parts of what are, I really believe, the single most complex pieces of machinery man has ever designed, our strategic nuclear forces. And yet we have not tested them to see if they actually still work in the most realistic, the most, authoritative manner possible. Is that something we should be concerned about and be revisiting as a matter of policy?
Look, it's no different really than to any of our listeners if you said, look, you take your car in to be really checked out, a thorough checkout. And what they do is they take out the starter and check that, then put it back in. And they take out the battery and put it back in. And they take out the light switch and put it back in. But they never test the entire car with all the systems in it. And oh, by the way, in some cases, these things don't interact the way they used to because some are made out of new materials. We don't have the old ones anymore. Some are made out of old materials. In some cases, they're still vacuum tubes because nobody's invested in the very precise, very safe, modern electronics. And so you've got Rube Goldberg sitting atop nuclear weapons. Even if we're not ever thinking we're going to use them, that's not a safe place to be by any stretch of the imagination.
Yeah. And again, this goes back to what we started with, Dan, and that is we want to deter adversaries and their aggressive behavior. We don't want to have to fight particularly thermonuclear wars. And the quality of our deterrent, if our adversaries are reckoning correctly, and I think they are, that we're allowing in the pursuit, as the president has said, of this lunatic notion, he doesn't call it lunatic, I do, of a world without nuclear weapons, in which we seem to be starting with ours, and exercising this kind of malfeasance, it seems to me, in terms of just science, let alone national security policy. That's not going to dissuade our enemies from their conclusion that we are a waning power and this is the moment for them to act with increasing aggressiveness. Dan, just to quickly hit a couple of other areas where we're unilaterally disarming. The president recently announced that we were going to get rid of all of the anti-personnel landmines that the United States has in its inventory. Talk a little bit about the advisability of doing that and what the risks might be.
There has been obviously a campaign against landmines, and rightly so when you're talking about nations or groups that are indiscriminate with their use of landmines. Not only is the U.S. military never indiscriminate in the use of landmines, we don't just put them out there on trails to kill innocents, but our mines, unlike most of everybody else, has a time limit to them. They dud themselves after a certain amount of time, whether you take them out of the ground or not. So in some respects, I would much rather have the world awash, if you will, in U.S. landmines, or certainly our allies and our troops defended by U.S. landmines that have to face Rube Goldberg systems with man in the loop that don't work very well, and have the rest of the world using cheap, insecure Chinese or Indian or Pakistani or Vietnamese landmines, which is the current situation.
Yeah. Dan, somebody pointed this out to me the other day that we talk a lot about improvised explosive devices. Well, in fact, those are landmines.
Yep,
In most cases, they're being used as those kinds of either anti-personnel or anti-vehicle mines. And as you've said so well, the kind of mines that we use are not indiscriminate. They do self-destruct or deactivate.
Yep.
And the cost to our people, if we don't have them to protect them at forward operating positions and, to channel the enemy's line of attack and so on, is assuredly going to be to put us at risk, and loss of life is certain to flow from it. Dan, in this respect, as in so many others, you have been a voice of both good judgment and hard experience. We appreciate your sharing it with us in this program, and for all that you do at the Lexington Institute. I hope you'll come back to us again in the near future because, needless to say, all of these fronts are ones that are active and likely to get much worse if we persist in some of the misbegotten policies we're engaged in at the moment.
As president, I will end misguided defense policies and stand with Caucus for Priorities in fighting special interests in Washington. First, I'll stop spending $9 billion a month in Iraq. I'm the only major candidate who opposed this war from the beginning, and as president, I will end it. Second, I will cut tens of billions of dollars in wasteful spending. I will cut investments in unproven missile defense systems. I will not weaponize space. I will slow our development of future combat systems, and I will institute an independent Defense Priorities Board to ensure that the quadrennial defense review is not used to justify unnecessary spending. Third, I will set a goal of a world without nuclear weapons. To seek that goal, I will not develop new nuclear weapons. I will seek a global ban on the production of fissile material, and I will negotiate with Russia to take our ICBMs off hair-trigger alert and to achieve deep cuts in our nuclear arsenals. You know where I stand. I've fought for open, ethical, and accountable government my entire public life. I don't switch positions or make promises that can't be kept. I don't posture on defense policy, and I don't take money from federal lobbyists for powerful defense contractors. As president, my sole priority for defense spending will be protecting the American people. Thanks so much.
Welcome back. We're doing a very special edition of our Secure Freedom Radio. We're visiting with Dr. Daniel Gouré, both by audio and, I'm very pleased to say, through the miracle of simulcast video here on 740 WSVR, the Tom Trento Show. Dan, we've talked about a lot of different issues, and I want to drill down on one that is a coming possible problem, and that is the Iranian nuclear weapons program that it appears now President Obama's negotiators are not going to prevent. In fact, if anything, it looks increasingly as this deadline of November 24th looms that the deal that they are prepared to strike will actually legitimate and assure that Iran gets a nuclear weapon. How serious a problem do you see that as being? And am I right in your estimation that that's where we're headed?
You're talking about a region that, if you will, is barely hanging on by its fingertips with what's going on all the way from Libya at one end, the rest of North Africa, Boko Haram, all the way over, and the recent war between Hamas and Israel. And now you are going to add nuclear weapons into the mix, or at least one country's nuclear weapons. I think there's no question. Anything that is not a lockdown on the Iranian nuclear weapons program, anything that says it's going to be we'll have a year's worth of warning, is virtually useless, because at a minimum, everybody else you can think of, the Turks, the Egyptians, the Saudis, are going to want to be hovering at no less a distance. And you and I both know from working in government, a year's worth of warning of breakout. Well, the breakout may have started, you get your warning 6 months later, and 3 months after that, the White House actually acknowledges that, the cat is out of the bag. So you have 3 months of real action before nuclear weapons start being tested, or worse, start going off other people's territory. It's a disaster.
Well, it is a disaster, Dan, especially if you've been wildly generous in your calculations here, and it turns out that it's a matter of weeks of lead time, if any, that the process towards that may well be advancing right now under our noses. And the president, the White House, is so committed to the deal that they refuse to acknowledge it until, as you say, you have weapons detonating someplace, God forbid. And yet, Dan, we're told that the president is very determined to get this done. Some of his advisors are describing it as comparable in importance to him, the legacy business, but beyond to the kind of effort he made on Obamacare. If that's true, and if he wants this deal so badly that he'll do anything to get it, doesn't it mean that it is absolutely imperative that the Congress of the United States, specifically under our Constitution, the Senate of the United States, have an opportunity to be a quality control authority, a check and balance on this kind of deal?
Look, there's no question that this is of such monumental importance with respect to U.S. security, because these weapons may well come back to haunt us, counterterrorism, the region, we go on and on and on, world's oil supply. It cannot be achieved and put into force without full congressional hearings and oversight. And frankly, if I were the incoming Congress, the incoming Senate Foreign Relations Committee, I would basically say, among other things, no business gets done in my committee if this agreement is not subject to full ratification. And I would expect McConnell, the incoming majority leader, the whole leadership, to stand by that. They have got to do this, or it's going to be 2 years of selling this country's foreign policy down the river.
Yeah, I want to come back to that in a moment, Dan, but just staying with the kind of threats that this would represent. Clearly, one of the countries most immediately in the crosshairs of the Iranian regime are the Israelis. And they are looking at truly an existential danger emerging with, it would now appear, the connivance of the Obama administration. Talk a little bit about, the character of U.S.-Israeli relations under Barack Obama writ large, but specifically what you think the Israelis are going to do in the face of this kind of prospect.
Well, it is amazing that any administration could take one of the closest relationships we've had with any country in my living memory and basically trash it, and do it not only behind the scenes in negotiations, but increasingly public in American magazine. And I am struck, in particular, this kind of conversation with a deadline looming, to have a senior White House official clearly with malice aforethought and being sent out to do it, to talk about the head of the Israeli government as being a chicken, what. One wonders if that is nothing more than a way to try, in their misguided approach, goad the Israelis into doing a military operation that we clearly are unwilling to do for ourselves. And it just, you wonder whether this is just schoolyard politics, in effect, run by people who shouldn't even be allowed on the playground.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Dan, what you were addressing a moment ago is very much uppermost on my mind, namely the need for the Congress to serve really as a counterweight to policies in all of these areas, not just the nuclear program with Iran, but well, the sequestration driven hollowing out of our military and the emboldening of our enemies and the undermining of our friends, including Israel, of course. Talk, if you would, a little bit about one of the pieces of this equation that seems to me to be a no brainer, and yet it appears that the new leadership of the Congress, the one that will be running the place come January, is about to tie their own hands with respect to so many of these things by agreeing to a what's called continuing resolution that would fund the government all the way through the remainder of the current fiscal year, which would go to October 1st. How problematic is that likely to be if by so doing they've essentially foreclosed the power of the purse and put themselves in a position where all of these things, the bad deals with Iran and heavens knows what else, Russia, the Chinese and so on, our responses there to are really very, very profoundly circumscribed.
We can talk about it in the foreign policy arena with respect to immigration. If you don't have control over the money going to the Department of Homeland Security and the Customs and Border Patrol, then what kind of leverage are you going to have if there's going to be blanket amnesty? Zero. But people intend to realize also is that a continuing resolution, it's an arcane thing in Washington budgeting, also requires that the monies be spent in any department the way they were the last year. So if you have a program that was just starting out last year and is now going to go to full rate production, you may not be able to do that. Something else, which is a program you would like to have terminated, but there's a new one coming up, you can't switch the money over. So you don't just limit the overall funds. It is like if they went into my wallet or our checkbook and said, well, you can pay that bill, but you can't pay that bill. And oh, by the way, I know your gas bill has gone up, but you can only pay the amount that was on the bill from last year. It's insanity from a practical governing point of view. And it also takes away what we all agree is the one lever, the real club that any Congress has vis-a-vis the executive branch, and that's the power of the purse. It would be madness at this point, given what the president just said the other day about how he intends to govern, to give away that instrument.
I couldn't agree more. We're speaking with Dr. Daniel Gouré, Vice President of the Lexington Institute. We're simulcasting this program of Secure Freedom Radio, a very special hour-long drill down on matters directly bearing on your national security and perhaps your personal survival. We're doing it in conjunction with Tom Trento's program. Tom is on vacation at 740 WSVR. I'm very pleased to be able to bring this program to you both through audio and video. Dan, just to tie that last piece together with what we've been talking about throughout the hour, and that is we're looking at a Congress that it seems to me has not covered itself in glory when it comes to providing really a counterweight to the executive branch by demonstrating a greater degree of national security mindedness than we've been seeing out of an Obama administration that is happily, unilaterally disarming and hollowing out the military and encouraging our allies to look to their own devices and emboldening our enemies. What if you were to give counsel to the new leadership of the Congress? Take 2 minutes on the subject because they're almost out of time. But what would you be recommending to John Boehner and to Senator Mitch McConnell in their respective bodies to resuscitate this national security mindedness and create really a loyal opposition to the dangerous practices that you've just described?
Well, you need a set of principles. You don't need a whole program, and it's hard to have a whole national security program out of the Congress. We all recognize that. But you need some basic principles. One is we have the world's best military, and it must be preserved. And to first order, that means it must be appropriately funded. And therefore, a way has got to be found around the cuts imposed by sequestration. Defense has already taken nearly $1 trillion worth of cuts over the last 6 years. It cannot sustain any more, and therefore an alternative must be found. If it means ultimately for the next 2 years that we have to give up on the domestic caps on sequestration, that may well be the price to be paid if an alternative can't be found. The money
It's
needs to be there.
it's anathema to an awful lot of folks,
I understand that.
particularly among our friends on the conservative side of the political spectrum, Dan Gouré. But I think you're absolutely right. At the very least, we have to stop doing what is, I think, indisputably the most important business of government in a manner that no business in the country would do, namely this kind of sequestration process. Dan Gouré, I can't thank you enough for both your past service to our country in the Defense Department and advising Homeland Security and so on, but also for the work you're doing at the Lexington Institute. It's incalculably important. I hope you'll come back to us again very soon. In the meantime, be well. I hope the rest of you will come back to us again tomorrow, same time, same station. Until then, this is Frank Gaffney. Thanks for listening.